Good morning, students. We'll continue this lesson, Mother's Day. Right? We had covered up the conversations between in the dialogue form of Doris and mother, Cyril and mother. Now we have reached when the husband, Mr. George, and George Pearson, how he is interacting with his wife, and he is another lazy and a bit of a slack person, and who is busy in his clubs and playing snooker and so many other things, and is not at all worried about his wife. Right? So please open your books, page number 44. We have covered up this part, right? So the last part of page number 44. Let me share the screen also. Yes. Wait a minute. This part we have covered. The misbehavior of Doris Pearson with Mrs. Pearson, right? And every time I remind you that the person whom these people are interacting at this stage, she is not their mother. We need to remind ourselves every time that that person is Mrs. Fitzgerald, right? So by this time you are very clear that Mrs. Pearson is not Mrs. Pearson, and right, Mrs. Fitzgerald is not Mrs. Fitzgerald. So let us move on this part, right? Yes. So, yes. Now Doris runs out left with a sob. I'm covering little from the yesterday's class. George stares her after a moment. Who is George? George is the father, as I discussed. Now he's a bit, maybe you can say, worried, but he sees the daughter crying and sobbing and running from one room to another. He feels something awkward and something, maybe some ill signs, or so what did she mean? Better ask her. Right? When George enters, the daughter says, you will come to know on your own. Right? You will come to know what is happening in the house. So when he asks Mrs. Pearson, she says, better ask her. Why you are asking me? Now, when he sees Mrs. Pearson having a drink, stout, he is amazed. What are you drinking stout for? Because I fancied some. I enjoy, I like, right? I wanted. At this time of the day, yes, what's wrong with it at this time of the day? So at this place, actually we had, stopped yesterday. George doesn't like the idea of Mrs. Pearson enjoying the stout, right? Let me admit others also. Just a minute. Yes. Now, dear students, the conversation between George Pearson and Mrs. Pearson. Please remind yourself, this Mrs. Pearson is disguise. She is Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is thrashing them, bashing them with her words, right? So, well, you're seeing me now. Yes, and I don't like it. It doesn't look right. I'm surprised at you that you are enjoying your stout at this time of the day. Well, that ought to be a nice change for you. What do you mean? This is a change for you, Mr. Pearson. So, what do you mean? Right? It must be some time since you were surprised at me, George. So now you be ready for the surprises. I don't like surprises. I'm all for a steady going on. You ought to know that by this time. By the way, I forgot to tell you this morning, I wouldn't want any tea. Special snooker match night at the club tonight. That's all right. There isn't any. There's no tea for you. You mean you didn't get any ready? Any tea ready for me? So yes, and a good thing too. And it has turned out. It has turned out. Now he's aggrieved. That's all very well. But suppose I had wanted some. Now the thing is, he doesn't want any tea, but he wants his wife to still make the tea and get it ready, right? So, and when she has not done this, he is annoyed. My goodness, listen to the man, annoyed because I don't get a tea for him and that he doesn't even want. So he wanted the tea, which he even today, there's no interest in having it, right? Ever tried that at the club? Have you ever tried this thing in the club, this type of behavior? Dear students, generally we are instructed, especially the children of your age, that why don't you do these things outside? Only at home, mother and father can bear, right? So many times we are often told that why don't you try all these things outside and you will come to know how people behave outside. So tried what at the club? Going up to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already poured it out. So I'm reading these lines again for you. Tried what at the club? What shall I try at the club? Going up to the bar and telling them you don't want a glass of beer, but you are annoyed because they haven't already served you or poured it out, right? You go to a restaurant, you ask, why have you not got the things ready that I always come and eat for? They'll not listen to you. They'll say, dear sir, dear ma'am, you haven't ordered yet. So this was the situation that they expected a lot. And when we expect a lot, we must be like that, right? So when we move through these literature lessons, we actually intervene, learn, imbibe deeply into human behavior. We need to introspect. Introspect means we need to think about ourselves, do some analytical activity about oneself. Where am I wrong in my relations? The people associated with me, they must not be troubled in the name of love. Mother should not be troubled because she's the mother and she's expected all the time to do her duties, right? So I don't know what you are talking about. They would laugh at you even more than they do now. Now who are they? Mrs. Pearson, she's very sarcastic at this moment and tells him the truth that club where you go to play snooker and other night activities, they laugh at you. They often laugh at you and they would laugh more now. Laugh at me? They don't laugh at me. Now he says, why would they laugh at me? They don't laugh at me. Of course they do. Now, Mrs. Pearson, the real Mrs. Pearson has never told this truth to George Pearson, that people outside many times laugh at you for your funny behavior, for your awkward behavior, for your crazy behavior. But this is Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is playing the role for the time being as Mrs. Pearson. And she discloses the truth that they laugh at you when you go to the club. Of course they do. I hope, dear students, this part is clear when Mrs. Pearson is dealing George and Mrs. Pearson, who is actually Mrs. Fitzgerald. Yes? This much part is clear? You can unmute yourself and speak. Okay? Very good. Kevin? Right? Your virtual responses, your speech responses will work. You ought to have found that out by this time. Anybody else would have done. You are one of their standing jokes, famous. They crack jokes on you. They consider you as a joke and very famous. They call you Pompey Ompy Pearson because they think you are so slow and pompous. Very showy, very gaudy, right? Living in pretensions, pretending a lot, and you're very slow, and they call you Pompey, Ompy Pearson. They have given you a funny name also. So George, never, and now he's upset. It has always beaten me why you should want to spend so much time at a place where they are always laughing at you behind your back and calling you names. Now Mrs. Pearson says, I have been always worried, and I was always worried about the thing that you spend your time where people don't like you, people make fun of you, they imitate your trends, the ways how you carry yourself, they call you by names, and still you go there and leave me and leave your wife and your family, leaving your wife at home night after night instead of going out with her, who doesn't make you look a fool. Right, dear students? So Cyril enters right with a glass of milk in one hand. Now there is a shift in the scene. Cyril is entering in one hand with a glass of milk and a thick slice of cake. Right? In the other, George, almost dazed, turns to him appealingly. Now George is looking at the children, especially Cyril. Here, Cyril, have you been with me to the club once or twice? They don't laugh at me and call me Pompey Ompy Pearson, do they? Cyril is also embarrassed, hesitates. Go on, tell me, do they? Now the father is angry. Tell me, Cyril, do they call me with names? Yes, well, yes, Dad, I'm afraid they do. So the son affirms. There's an affirmation from son's side. Yes, Dad, they do call you by such funny names, right? George slowly looks from one to the other and staggered, right? Staggered here, he's shocked. Here the word staggered means he's shocked. George exits left slowly, almost as if somebody had hit him over the head. He's very upset to listen that where he goes, they make fun of him. And he is being ridiculed at the back, right? So you can frame a character sketch here of George Pearson. This is the part where we can frame some points about this chapter. You need to prepare all the character sketches. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson, George, and their children, right? So, now, you shouldn't have told him that, Mum. That's not fair. You have hurt his feelings, mine too. Sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. Mrs. Pearson says that it is good that sometimes, and it brings out good results when you hurt some particular people at the right moments. The truth ought not to hurt anybody for long. If your father didn't go to the club so often, perhaps they would stop laughing at him. I doubt it, gloomily, sadly, right? I doubt this thing. Now, Mrs. Pearson. Now, dear students, there is a question, where is the real Mrs. Pearson? This is Mrs. Fitzgerald, George, Cyril, and Doris. Where is the mistress of this house? Where has she gone? When we have started this lesson, we discussed this thing that Mrs. Fitzgerald has sent her to her house, right? She has not returned yet. Possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion is worth having. What do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races. Greyhound is a type of dog, right? Hounds are dogs. Greyhounds are types of dogs which are made to run. So this is greyhound races. There's a breed of the dog which have long legs, right? So this is that greyhound breed. And dirt tracks and ice shows. So you spend money in greyhound races, dirt tracks and ice shows. And Cyril, well, what if I do? I've got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I? Now, can't I enjoy for some time if I wish to? Mrs. Pearson, I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where is it getting you? Is a sharp, hurried knocking heard off left. Might be for me, I'll see. And it is that silly old bag from the next door, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now there is an entry We discussed one character just now, where is real Mrs. Pearson. So Mrs. Fitzgerald has come from the neighborhood. She is Mrs. Pearson. Let me again remind you, they have changed their roles, bodies, and they were playing each other's role. So now Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is sitting as Mrs. Pearson, right? And Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is actually Mrs. Pearson, is standing at the door. And she has come after a couple of hours, right? Come in. And it is that Cyril says, it is that silly old bag, that friend of yours whom they used to call silly old bag. Now Mrs. Fitzgerald is listening about her that they call me silly old bag. You don't want her here, do you? Mrs. Pearson, certainly I do. Ask her in, and don't call her a silly old bag either. She's a very nice woman with a lot more sense than you will ever have, right? So now this is a good, entry at the beautiful moment when Mrs. Fitzgerald is Mrs. Pearson. They don't know who is inside and outside, and they are talking ill of her. And she has come to know what they talk about me. And she is there she has already taken the responsibility to teach them a nice lesson, right? So Mrs. Fitzgerald, come in Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now dear students, this Mrs. Fitzgerald is Mrs. Pearson. And if we see Cyril talking, so Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fitzgerald, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Pearson. Now, I just wondered if everything is all right. No, it isn't. Mrs. Pearson, of course it is. You be quiet. Why should I be quiet? Because I tell you to, you silly, spoiled young Piken. You be quiet. Now, oh no, Shirley. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, just let me manage my family in my own way, please. Yes, but Cyril. Now, Mr. Cyril Pearson, to you. Please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now, they are talking, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is behaving like Mrs. Pearson because she is Mrs. Pearson. She is not liking that her family is being scolded so badly, right? And oh dear, what is happening? Nothing much, just putting them in the right places, that's all. Doing what you ought to have done since long, right? And you should have done all these things long back. Now, dear students, wait a minute, see this Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson. The page number 40, this particular page 47, where Mrs. Fitzgerald and Mrs. Pearson are discussing this, you can change. You can, with the pencil also, you can change in the bracket. And you'll understand very nicely these dialogues. Okay? So wherever there is Mrs. Fitzgerald, you will write with the pencil and the in the bracket P. And where it is P, you can write F. So you'll understand. Now, oh dear, what is happening? Now, at this stage, Mrs. Fitzgerald is very timid and Mrs. Pearson is strong and sinister and evil looking and dangerous, right? So, nothing much, just putting them in the right places. Is George home? Right? Yes, I have been telling him what they think of him at the club. Well, they think a lot of him, don't they? No, they don't, and now he knows it. Oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now underline this line in your lesson and see Mrs. Fitzgerald calling Mrs. Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald. So you cannot hide the truth. It comes on your tongue. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is calling Mrs. Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald. Nonsense, doing them all a world of good, and they'll be eating out your hand soon. You'll see. I don't think that I want them eating out my hand. Well, whatever you want, they'll be doing it, all three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson, you'll come to know. Right? Now here, please underline again, Mrs. Pearson calling Mrs. Pearson again. So this is Mrs. Fitzgerald guiding Mrs. Pearson. That Mrs. Pearson, check, these people will hurt you all the time. This is the right time when you teach them a nice lesson. George now enters, right? And he is unpleasantly surprised, right? Then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, Mrs. Fitzgerald to Mrs. Pearson. He is confused, baffled, right? Dear students, we'll cover up a little bit and this lesson will end by tomorrow. Okay, just looked in for a minute. I suppose Mrs. Fitzgerald. Well, yes, I suppose so, George. Okay, so now you can see the husband is talking to a wife who is not his wife. And now who has come as Mrs. Fitzgerald is actually his wife. But they cannot find out this. So, George just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Well, yes, I suppose so, George. Now, George, now he sees that my neighbor is calling me out, George. Oh, I'm sorry. What does it matter? Your name is George, isn't it? Who do you think you are, Duke of Edinburgh? If Mrs. Fitzgerald is calling you George, what is the problem in that? Right? So what these dialogues, children, let the readers enter into lot of things of those times when these were written. And for the present, they play a big role, right? All the literature lessons, poems, these dramas and prose lessons that we read, they have a message indeed, a deep message indeed. What has he, sorry, got to do with it? Just tell me that. And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? No tea, Pompey, Ompy, Pearson. And poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs. Yes, crying her eyes out. Right? Dear students, we'll continue this lesson from page number 48 tomorrow. I hope you have understood this much part. Okay? We'll continue this lesson tomorrow, dear students. God bless you all. Thank you.